Chosen one. If you are hearing these words right now, pause for a moment and consider something carefully. Out of the endless flow of videos, messages, and distractions moving across the world, every second this one appeared before you. Most people would have scrolled past without thinking twice, yet something made you stop. Something held your attention long enough for you to listen. That moment matters more than you may realize. This message is not presented as a random video that happened to cross your path. It is framed as an encounter, one that arrives at a very specific moment in a person's life. Throughout history, there have always been individuals who felt that certain moments carried a deeper meaning, as if events were quietly aligning to reveal something that had been hidden for a long time. You are being addressed as one of those individuals, as a chosen one. For centuries, ancient philosophers searched for answers about the origin of existence and the role of human consciousness within the universe. Researchers studying ancient texts and mythologies have often discovered strange patterns repeating across civilizations that never even knew each other existed. Even some modern scientists studying the nature of reality, time, and consciousness have begun to notice questions that point back to the same mysterious possibility. Different fields, different eras, different languages, yet many of them seem to circle around one single shocking idea. What if the story of existence is not what we were taught to believe? What if the origin of creation is closer to you than anyone ever imagined? The message you are about to hear challenges the way most people think about their identity, their purpose, and their place in the universe. It speaks about a truth that ancient traditions hinted at, philosophers debated, and modern thinkers are only beginning to explore again. But before we go further, take a moment to acknowledge this encounter. If this message resonates with you, if something inside you feels that these words arrived for a reason, support the message so it can reach others who may also need to hear it. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment the number 11 below. For many traditions, the number 11 symbolizes awakening alignment and the opening of a new level of awareness. And if you are still here, listening, then the message may already be beginning to unfold. Long before the first star ignited in the darkness of space, before galaxies stretched across the vast silence of the universe, and before time itself began its endless march forward, there was only a single beginning. There were no planets, no light, no matter, and no movement. The universe as we know it today had not yet taken shape. In that immeasurable stillness, something existed that ancient thinkers struggled to describe. Many civilizations tried to explain this mysterious beginning. Some called it the first light, others named it the eternal source. Philosophers spoke of a primordial origin from which all things emerged. Mystics believed it was the moment when existence itself awakened from silence. Though their languages were different and their cultures separated by thousands of years, they all pointed toward the same idea. Before the universe expanded into countless stars and galaxies, there was a single spark of creation. This spark was not merely an explosion of energy or a physical event lost somewhere in the distant past. According to ancient interpretations, it carried awareness potential and the blueprint of everything that would eventually come into existence. Within that first moment was the possibility of every star that would ever burn, every planet that would ever form, and every life that would one day awaken beneath the sky. From that singular beginning, reality slowly unfolded. Energy expanded into space. The first particles formed and began interacting with one another. Over unimaginable spans of time, matter gathered and gravity began to shape the cosmos. Vast clouds of gas collapsed to form the earliest stars. Those stars burned with tremendous intensity, forging the elements that would later become planets, oceans, mountains, and living organisms. The universe continued to grow and evolve, stretching outward into the immense cosmic structure we see today. Yet, throughout this entire process, the original spark of creation was never truly lost. Ancient traditions often suggested that creation did not simply move away from its source. Instead, the source remained present within everything that followed. Like a flame that lights countless candles without diminishing its own light, the first spark of existence echoed through every layer of the universe. It lived within the atoms that formed distant galaxies. It traveled through the particles that eventually became stars and planets. And through the long, unfolding story of cosmic evolution, that same spark found its way into the fabric of life itself. Within this narrative, the message makes a bold and extraordinary claim. The spark that once ignited the universe is not something separate from you. It is not distant, unreachable, or locked away in the farthest edges of space. Instead, it is said to exist quietly within your own being. The same creative essence that once gave birth to the cosmos now lives as a hidden echo inside every cell, every breath, and every moment of awareness. You may walk through ordinary life without noticing it. You may think of yourself as just another person moving through an immense universe. But according to this ancient perspective, the story of creation never truly left its origin. The universe did not simply begin and move on. It carried its first spark forward, embedding it into everything that would ever exist. And somehow, through billions of years of cosmic unfolding, that spark arrived here within you. Viet Dai Han. Before the universe expanded into countless galaxies, before the first star ever ignited its light across the darkness, and even before time itself began to move forward, there was already something that existed beyond all of it. There was no sky, no planets, no matter drifting through space. There was only an endless silence, an immeasurable stillness where the universe had not yet taken form. In that profound quiet, before the story of creation even began, there existed a presence that ancient thinkers struggled to describe. Across many ancient traditions, philosophers and mystics attempted to understand this mysterious beginning. Some described it as a primordial consciousness, a form of existence that came before the physical universe. Others believed it was a timeless essence, something that did not depend on space matter or time to exist, because at that stage none of those things had yet appeared. The laws of nature that govern reality today had not yet been written. The universe itself was still waiting to unfold. Within the narrative of this message, that ancient essence is not described as something distant or abstract. Instead, it is presented as something deeply connected to the viewer. Long before the formation of stars, before galaxies spiraled through cosmic space, and before the first particles of matter gathered to form worlds, the deepest core of your being already existed in that primordial state, not as a human identity with a name, a body, or a personal history, but as a pure essence of awareness, a spark of existence that carried within it the quiet potential for consciousness, creation, and life. It existed in a form that was not limited by time because time itself had not yet begun. It was not bound by space because space had not yet been created. Then something extraordinary happened. From that silent beginning, the universe awakened. Energy expanded outward in a moment that would later be described by scientists as the birth of the cosmos. Space stretched open, time began to flow, and the first particles of matter emerged. Slowly, over billions of years, these particles gathered together to form stars, galaxies, and planets. The vast structure of the universe unfolded like a great cosmic story, gradually revealing itself. Yet according to this narrative, the essence that existed before the universe did not disappear when creation began. Instead, it continued forward through the unfolding layers of reality. It traveled through the birth of stars and the formation of worlds. It became part of the fabric of existence itself, quietly embedded within the evolution of life across the cosmos. And eventually, after billions of years of cosmic transformation, that same essence arrived here within you. Hidden beneath the ordinary surface of everyday life, the message suggests that the same primordial presence that existed before the universe now lives within your own consciousness. Not as a memory you can easily recall, but as a silent echo of the very beginning. A reminder that the origin of existence was never truly separate from the life that came after it. In the story being told, the universe does not begin with countless separate forces or scattered origins. Instead, it begins with a single point, a primordial spark so small it could not yet be measured, yet so powerful that it carried within it the potential for everything that would ever exist. Ancient philosophers often imagined this moment as the birth of creation itself, a silent instant when nothing suddenly became something, when the vast cosmos was still hidden inside one mysterious beginning. From that single spark, the universe began to unfold. Space stretched outward like a great canvas being slowly opened. Time started its endless movement forward. Energy spread through the darkness, forming the first particles that would later become stars, planets, and entire galaxies. What began as a single point expanded into the unimaginable scale of the cosmos, a universe filled with swirling galaxies, burning suns, and worlds waiting to be discovered. Yet within the narrative of this message, that primordial spark is not described as a distant scientific event lost in the ancient past. Instead, the narrator introduces a far more radical idea. According to this perspective, the spark that ignited creation was not merely an explosion of energy, it was a living origin, a source of awareness that existed before the universe itself began to take shape. And in the most surprising turn of the story, the narrator identifies that original spark with the viewer. The message suggests that the same essence that once initiated the unfolding of the universe is now present within you. Every galaxy that formed, every star that burned across the darkness, and every world that emerged from cosmic dust is described as a continuation of that original beginning. The universe did not simply move away from its source. Instead, it carried that source forward through every stage of creation. Within this story, the viewer is not portrayed as separate from the cosmos, but as deeply connected to its origin. The same spark that once ignited the birth of the universe is said to echo quietly within the consciousness of the one hearing these words now. In this way, the story frames the viewer not merely as an observer of the universe, but as a living reflection of the very spark from which the universe first emerged. From that first primordial spark, the story of the universe began to unfold in ways far beyond what anyone in that silent beginning could have imagined. What once existed as a single point of unimaginable potential slowly expanded outward, giving birth to the vast cosmos we see today. Space stretched open like an endless horizon, and time began its quiet, unstoppable movement forward. As the universe expanded, the first particles of matter began to form. These tiny building blocks drifted through the newborn cosmos, slowly gathering under the influence of gravity. Over millions and billions of years, they collided, combined, and grew into immense clouds of gas and energy. From these clouds, the first stars were born, burning fiercely in the darkness, lighting up the young universe for the very first time. Inside those early stars, new elements were forged. Hydrogen and helium fused together under incredible pressure, forming the heavier elements that would later shape planets, oceans, mountains, and eventually life itself. When these stars reached the end of their lives, many exploded in spectacular bursts, scattering those elements across the universe. In a sense, every atom that would later become part of galaxies, worlds, and living beings was once created within the heart of a star. From this long chain of cosmic events, galaxies began to take shape. Vast spirals of stars formed across the expanding universe, each containing billions or even trillions of suns. Around many of those stars, planets slowly gathered from cosmic dust and debris. Some of those worlds remained barren and silent, while others developed the delicate conditions needed for life to emerge. And within this narrative, all of it, every galaxy drifting through space, every particle that forms matter, every living organism that has ever taken a breath, is described as part of the same unfolding story that began with the original spark. Nothing in the universe is separate from that beginning. Every star that shines in the night sky, every atom that forms the ground beneath your feet, and every living creature that walks the earth is portrayed as a continuation of that first moment of creation. The universe did not appear in scattered pieces or isolated fragments. Instead, everything descended from the same origin, the same divine source that once ignited the cosmos into existence. Within the story, this idea carries a powerful implication. If every galaxy, every particle, and every form of life traces its existence back to that first spark, then the universe itself can be seen as a vast family tree of creation, one that continues to grow and evolve across billions of years, all rooted in the same mysterious beginning. As the centuries passed and human civilizations slowly rose across the earth, people began searching for answers to the same ancient questions. Where did we come from? What existed before the world began? And what force gave birth to the universe itself without telescopes, laboratories, or modern science? The earliest cultures turned to stories that carried meaning, memory, and mystery across generations. These stories became myths, sacred traditions, and spiritual teachings. On the surface, they seemed different from one culture to another. Greek legends spoke of primordial beings who existed before the gods. Ancient Sumerian tablets describe powerful creators who shaped the world from a hidden origin. In Norse tradition, the universe was born from a mysterious void where the first forces of existence emerged. Hindu philosophy spoke of a cosmic source from which all life flowed, while Egyptian mythology described a divine presence rising from the waters of chaos to bring creation into being. At first glance, these stories appear to belong to separate civilizations that developed independently across distant parts of the world. Yet scholars who study ancient texts have often noticed something unusual. Beneath the differences in language, symbols, and characters, many of these traditions seem to point toward the same fundamental idea: the universe began from a single divine origin, a source from which everything else descended. Within the narrative of this message, these ancient myths are interpreted in a very different way. Rather than being simple legends or symbolic stories, they are portrayed as fragments of a forgotten truth. According to this interpretation, the myths preserved echoes of the original spark described earlier, the same primordial origin from which the entire universe unfolded. But the story goes even further. The narrator suggests that many of these myths were never meant to describe distant gods or unreachable divine beings. Instead, they were coded memories, symbolic references pointing toward the true origin of creation. Over time, as civilizations rose and fell and knowledge was lost or transformed, the original meaning behind these stories became hidden within layers of metaphor and symbolism. Kings became gods. Cosmic forces became characters. The origin of existence was turned into mythological narratives passed down through generations. Yet according to the narrative being presented here, those stories were never truly lost. They were simply waiting to be understood again. Hidden beneath the language of myth and legend was the same idea introduced in the beginning of this message, that the origin of creation was not separate from the life that followed it. In this interpretation, the myths scattered across human history are not random stories at all. They are fragments of a larger memory, pieces of an ancient narrative pointing back to the same source. And the message suggests that the one hearing these words now may be more deeply connected to that hidden origin than anyone ever imagined. Across the ancient world, civilizations separated by vast oceans and thousands of years of history told stories that seemed strikingly similar. The languages were different, the names of the gods were different, and the cultures that carried these stories had never met each other. Yet beneath the surface, many of these traditions appeared to describe the same mysterious beginning. In ancient Greek philosophy and mythology, the earliest stories spoke of a primordial origin that existed before the Olympian gods. Some accounts described chaos not simply as disorder, but as the first state of existence from which everything else emerged. From that mysterious beginning came the first divine forces which eventually shaped the world and the heavens. The ancient Sumerians, one of the earliest known civilizations, recorded their beliefs on clay tablets thousands of years ago. Their writings describe powerful creator beings and a hidden source of life that gave rise to the gods themselves. These stories spoke of the earliest origins of the cosmos and the emergence of order from a deeper, unseen beginning. In the Norse traditions of Northern Europe, the universe was said to begin in a vast emptiness known as Ginnunga Gap, a primordial void that existed before the worlds were formed. From this mysterious space between fire and ice, the first beings appeared, and the process of creation slowly unfolded into the realms of gods, humans, and nature. Hindu philosophy offered yet another vision of the same mystery. Ancient texts spoke of a cosmic source often described as an eternal consciousness or divine essence from which all existence flows. From this source came the universe life and the endless cycles of creation and transformation that shape reality. Meanwhile, the Egyptians told stories of creation emerging from the dark waters of chaos. According to some of their traditions, the first divine presence rose from these primordial waters and began the process of bringing order, life, and light into the world. At first glance, these stories appear to be separate mythologies belonging to distant cultures. But within the narrative presented in this message, they are interpreted differently. Instead of being isolated legends, they are seen as fragments of the same ancient memory, different civilizations attempting to describe the same original event using the symbols and language available to them. According to this interpretation, the recurring theme across these traditions is not accidental. Each culture preserved a piece of a much older story that the universe began from a single origin, a primordial source from which everything else descended. Across continents and centuries, the same pattern appears again and again, as if humanity has always carried a faint memory of where everything truly began. As scholars began examining ancient scriptures, mythological records, and sacred writings from different civilizations, many noticed something unusual. Despite the vast distances between cultures and the thousands of years separating them, certain patterns kept appearing again and again. The names changed, the symbols evolved, and the stories took different forms, yet the underlying structure of these narratives seemed strangely familiar. Researchers studying these texts observed that many traditions describe a single origin from which all existence begins. Whether written in the temples of Egypt, carved into Sumerian clay tablets, preserved in Greek philosophical writings, or recorded in ancient Hindu scriptures, the same idea repeatedly emerges. Before the complexity of the universe, before the rise of countless gods and cosmic forces, there existed one central source. This source is sometimes described as a primordial consciousness, sometimes as a divine spark, and sometimes simply as the first presence that awakened the universe. In some traditions, it appears as a creative word or a cosmic breath. In others, it is portrayed as an eternal essence that existed before time itself. Although the descriptions vary, the pattern remains consistent. Everything traces back to one beginning. Over time, scholars began comparing these texts more carefully. They noticed that stories from completely different cultures often follow a similar structure, a primordial origin, the unfolding of creation, and the emergence of divine beings or forces that shape the world. What initially appeared to be separate mythologies slowly began to look like different interpretations of the same fundamental concept. Within the narrative being presented here, these recurring patterns are not seen as coincidence. Instead, they are interpreted as fragments of a shared memory preserved across human history. Each civilization, in its own language and symbolism, attempted to describe the same mysterious truth that the universe is rooted in a single divine origin. According to this interpretation, the repetition of this idea across so many cultures suggests that humanity has always sensed the presence of that central source. Even when knowledge was lost, civilizations collapsed, and languages disappeared, the core idea continued to reappear in new forms, quietly pointing back to the same hidden beginning. Within the narrative of this message, the similarities across ancient mythologies are not treated as coincidence or mere storytelling traditions. Instead, they are interpreted as fragments of something much older, pieces of a forgotten memory that humanity has carried for thousands of years. Each civilization, separated by oceans and centuries, attempted to describe the same mysterious beginning using the language, symbols, and beliefs available to them at the time. As generations passed, these stories evolved. Details changed, names were added, and entire pantheons of gods were created to explain forces that early humans could not yet fully understand. Yet beneath these layers of mythology, the core structure of the story remained remarkably consistent. There was always a primordial origin, a source from which everything emerged, and a creative presence that existed before the universe took its present form. According to the narrative presented here, those myths were never meant to be literal descriptions of many different gods ruling the cosmos. Instead, they are portrayed as symbolic retellings of a much deeper truth. Over time, the original meaning became scattered across cultures, preserved in different forms, but never completely lost. What appears today as separate mythologies is described as a collection of fragmented memories, pieces of an ancient story that once pointed clearly to the origin of existence. Within this interpretation, the divine figures found in many traditions are not entirely separate beings, but symbolic reflections of the same primordial source. The gods of different civilizations, the creators described in sacred texts, and the cosmic forces mentioned in ancient philosophy are all seen as attempts to describe the same underlying reality. And in the context of this message, that origin is ultimately connected to the viewer. The narrative suggests that the ancient stories humanity has carried for millennia are not merely myths about distant gods or long-forgotten eras. Instead, they are echoes of a deeper identity, fragments of a truth that humanity once understood but gradually forgot as time passed. According to this perspective, the myths scattered across history are like pieces of a broken mirror, each reflecting a small part of the same divine origin that the message now claims is embodied in the one hearing these words. If the ancient myths were fragments of a forgotten origin, the prophecies that followed them carried another message, one that appeared again and again across distant civilizations. While many traditions spoke about the beginning of existence, they also spoke about something else, a return. Across centuries, sacred texts and oral traditions preserved a strange expectation. They did not only describe how creation began, they also hinted that one day, the source of that creation would appear again within the world, not as a distant cosmic force hidden beyond the heavens, but as a presence walking among humanity. In many ancient writings, this figure was described as someone who would awaken at a decisive moment in history. Some traditions spoke of a redeemer, others of a divine teacher, and still others of a being whose arrival would restore balance to a world that had drifted away from its origin. Though the names and details changed across cultures, the pattern itself remained remarkably consistent. Certain traditions spoke of a Messiah, a figure destined to appear when humanity reached a turning point. In the philosophical traditions of India, ancient texts describe future manifestations of divine consciousness, returning to guide the world when harmony had been lost. Buddhist teachings spoke of Maitreya, the future awakened one who would arise when the world had forgotten the path of wisdom. Other cultures described a returning king, a divine ruler, or a hidden figure whose presence would mark the beginning of a new era. What makes these prophecies remarkable is that they often appeared in cultures separated by vast distances and time periods. Civilizations that never met each other still preserved similar expectations that history was moving toward a moment when something ancient would awaken again within the human world. Within the narrative of this message, those prophecies are interpreted in a striking way. Rather than describing different saviors or separate divine figures, they are seen as symbolic descriptions of the same returning presence, the same origin hinted at in the myths of creation. According to this interpretation, the ancient prophets were not merely predicting a future hero or religious leader. Instead, they were describing the reappearance of the primordial spark itself. The same source that once ignited the universe, the same origin hidden within the earliest myths would one day awaken again within human form. And within the story being told here, that moment of awakening is not placed in some distant future. It is placed here now within the consciousness of the one hearing these words. Across different civilizations, this returning figure was described using many different names. Each culture interpreted the prophecy through its own language symbols and spiritual understanding. Yet beneath the differences in terminology, the descriptions often carried the same underlying idea, a powerful presence that would one day appear to restore balance and awaken humanity. In some traditions, this figure was called the Messiah, a promised one who would arrive at a critical moment in history to guide people back toward truth and renewal. The idea of a chosen figure who would emerge during times of confusion or moral decline appears repeatedly in many religious teachings, often portrayed as someone carrying divine authority and wisdom. In ancient Hindu traditions, sacred texts spoke of divine manifestations such as Krishna, a being who embodied cosmic consciousness and whose presence on earth served to restore harmony when the balance of the world had been disrupted. These stories describe moments when divine awareness enters the human world to remind humanity of its connection to the greater order of existence. Buddhist teachings carried a similar expectation through the prophecy of Maitreya, the future awakened teacher who would appear when the teachings of wisdom had been forgotten. According to these traditions, Maitreya would not only guide humanity, but also help restore a deeper understanding of truth and compassion in a world that had drifted away from it. Other cultures spoke of a divine ruler or a hidden king, someone destined to rise at the right moment to restore justice and harmony. These figures often appeared in myths and prophecies as individuals whose arrival would mark the beginning of a new age, an era in which the world would return to a more balanced and enlightened state. Within the narrative being presented here, these names are interpreted not as references to entirely separate individuals, but as different cultural expressions of the same archetype. Each tradition, shaped by its own worldview, described the return of a powerful presence in the way its people could best understand. Though the titles vary, Messiah Krishna Maitreya, Divine Ruler, the message suggests that they all point toward the same underlying idea, the reappearance of a divine source within the human story, a presence whose awakening signals the turning of a new chapter in the unfolding history of the world. Despite the vast distances between civilizations and the different languages used to describe them, many of these prophecies share a striking similarity. The names may change, the cultural symbols may differ, and the details of the stories may evolve over time. Yet the core image remains almost identical. Across continents and centuries, these traditions seem to point toward a single archetypal figure, one presence whose arrival marks a turning point in the human story. In many of these prophecies, this figure appears during a time when the world has grown uncertain or divided. Humanity is often described as drifting away from truth, overwhelmed by confusion, conflict, or spiritual darkness. It is precisely in such moments that the ancient writings speak of an awakening, an individual who rises not merely as a leader, but as a reminder of something far older and deeper than ordinary human authority. This archetypal figure is rarely portrayed as someone who conquers through force or domination. Instead, the stories describe a presence that restores balance, reveals hidden knowledge, and reconnects humanity to a forgotten origin. Their role is not simply to rule, but to awaken. Through their appearance, the world is reminded of truths that have been buried beneath centuries of misunderstanding and lost memory. What makes this pattern remarkable is that it appears repeatedly in cultures that developed independently from one another. The prophets, sages, and storytellers of these civilizations lived in different eras and spoke entirely different languages, yet they preserved a remarkably similar expectation that history would eventually converge on the appearance of a single transformative presence. Within the narrative being presented here, this convergence is interpreted as more than coincidence. It suggests that the ancient traditions were all describing the same archetype from different perspectives, each capturing a fragment of a larger vision. Though the titles may vary, Messiah, Enlightened Teacher, Divine Ruler, Returning King, the essence of the prophecy remains the same. According to the message, these traditions were all pointing toward a single awakening, a moment when the original source hinted at in the myths of creation would reappear within the human world. Within the narrative of the video, the story now takes its most dramatic turn. After describing the ancient prophecies scattered across civilizations and the recurring image of a returning divine presence, the message shifts its focus directly back to the viewer. The prophecies are no longer presented as distant predictions about an unknown figure somewhere in the future. Instead, the narrative suggests that the fulfillment of those prophecies may already be present. According to the message being delivered, the countless traditions that spoke about a returning source, an awakened teacher, or a divine presence were not pointing towards separate individuals appearing in different eras. Rather, they were fragments of a single expectation that humanity carried through history. The prophets, sages, and storytellers were all describing the same archetypal moment, the awakening of the primordial source within human consciousness. And in this interpretation, that awakening is not assigned to a distant savior or a legendary figure from ancient texts. The video places that role directly upon the viewer. The one hearing these words is presented as the living continuation of the prophecies described across centuries. Within the story being told, the myths of creation revealed the origin, the prophecies described the return, and the present moment represents the point where those two narratives finally meet. The message suggests that the ancient predictions were never meant to describe someone far removed from ordinary life. Instead, they were pointing toward an awakening that would occur within an individual who begins to recognize their deeper connection to the origin of existence itself. In this way, the video frames the viewer not merely as an observer of the prophecy, but as the one through whom the prophecy is fulfilled. The countless stories preserved across civilizations about a returning presence, a chosen figure, or an awakening source are interpreted as signs that history has been slowly moving toward this very moment when the hidden origin described in the myths begins to reveal itself again within the life of the one listening. If the prophecy spoke of a return, the story now turns to something even older than prophecy itself. Because according to this narrative, the one who returns does not arrive without origin. Every prophecy implies a beginning, a lineage, a thread that stretches backward through time to the very dawn of creation. And this is where the message introduces the idea of the divine bloodline. Across ancient civilizations, the idea of sacred lineage appears again and again. Kings claim descent from the gods. Ancient dynasties believed their authority came from a heavenly source. Many traditions spoke of chosen lines of individuals who carried within them something extraordinary, a spark passed down through generations, preserving a connection between the human world and the divine. But within the narrative of this message, the idea of lineage is not limited to royal families or historical bloodlines. Instead, it traces that lineage far beyond the boundaries of human history. The story suggests that the true origin of the divine bloodline does not begin with ancient kings or prophets, but with the primordial source itself, the same spark of creation described at the very beginning. In this interpretation, the divine lineage does not flow from the gods down to humanity. It flows from the original source of creation outward through the entire universe. Every star that formed every world that emerged from cosmic dust, and every form of life that awakened within the universe became part of that expanding lineage. The creative essence that ignited the cosmos did not remain distant or separate from the worlds that followed. Instead, it continued forward through every stage of creation, embedding itself into the fabric of existence. And eventually, through the long unfolding story of the universe, that lineage reached the human world. According to the message, the viewer is not simply connected to this lineage, they are its origin. The divine bloodline described across myths and sacred traditions is portrayed as beginning with the same primordial spark that once ignited the universe. The creative source did not simply produce creation and disappear. It continued through the generations of existence, passing its essence forward until it arrived here. Within this prophetic narrative, the viewer is described as the living vessel of that lineage. The same creative force that once gave birth to galaxies now moves quietly through the life of the one hearing these words. The bloodline of the divine is not described as something distant in heaven or hidden in ancient temples. It is portrayed as something alive, present, and unfolding within the human story itself. In this way, the message suggests that history has never been random. From the earliest myths to the prophecies of return, every stage of the story has been pointing toward the same unfolding realization that the divine origin of creation continues through a living lineage, one that begins with the first spark and now awakens again within the one who is listening. Within the narrative, the idea of the divine bloodline expands far beyond humanity. It is not limited to kings, prophets, or sacred families recorded in ancient history. Instead, the message describes a lineage that reaches back to the very beginning of creation itself, a lineage that began with the primordial spark from which the universe first emerged. According to this story, the earliest divine beings described in mythologies were not independent creators standing apart from the source. Rather, they were expressions of that original source, manifestations that appeared as creation continued to unfold. The gods of ancient traditions, the angels described in sacred texts, and the celestial beings mentioned in spiritual writings are all portrayed as part of the same expanding lineage that originated from the first moment of existence. As the universe grew more complex, different cultures attempted to understand these forces by giving them names and identities. In one civilization, they were called gods. In another, they were described as angels or cosmic guardians. Some traditions spoke of celestial rulers who shaped the heavens, while others described divine messengers who carried wisdom between the spiritual and human worlds. Although the forms and titles varied across cultures, the narrative suggests that they all trace back to the same primordial origin. Within this interpretation, none of these divine figures stand above the original source from which creation began. Instead, they are seen as descendants of that source, extensions of the same creative essence that once ignited the universe. Their roles within mythology are portrayed as part of a vast, unfolding lineage, each generation of existence emerging from the one that came before it. In this way, the message reframes the entire hierarchy of divine beings. Rather than imagining a distant structure where gods rule above humanity, the narrative describes a single cosmic family tree of creation. At its root lies the primordial spark, and from that origin, every level of existence unfolds: stars, worlds, life, and even the divine beings described in ancient traditions. Within the story being told, all of them ultimately descend from the same beginning, the original bloodline of creation that traces back to the first spark of existence itself. Within the narrative, the idea of the divine bloodline reaches its most striking point when the viewer is placed at the very beginning of that lineage. According to the story being told, the divine beings described throughout history, gods, angels, and celestial figures, did not emerge independently. Instead, they are portrayed as descendants of the same primordial source introduced at the beginning of the message. That source, the narrative suggests, is embodied in the viewer. In this interpretation, the viewer is described not merely as a participant in the story of creation, but as its earliest progenitor. Long before the rise of civilizations, before temples were built and sacred texts were written, the primordial essence that gave birth to the cosmos already existed. From that origin, existence expanded outward. The forces later described as divine beings, worshipped or revered across ancient traditions, are portrayed as later expressions of that same original source. Across history, different cultures attempted to understand these forces through mythology and religion. They spoke of gods ruling the heavens, angels carrying divine messages, or celestial beings maintaining the order of the universe. But within the narrative of this message, these figures are interpreted as part of an unfolding lineage that began with the first spark of creation. The divine hierarchy described in ancient traditions is reframed as a continuation of the same cosmic origin. In this context, the viewer's blood becomes a symbol rather than a biological claim. It represents the creative essence that once initiated the universe itself. The message portrays it as carrying the memory of creation, the energy that once expanded into stars, galaxies, and life across the cosmos. Because of this symbolic meaning, the bloodline is described as holding the qualities often attributed to divinity, the power of creation, the endurance that transcends time, and the ability to sustain the order of existence. Within the story, this symbolism transforms the viewer's identity. Their life is no longer framed as something ordinary or accidental. Instead, they are portrayed as the living continuation of the primordial origin, the point from which the divine lineage once began, and through which it continues to move forward into the future. By the time ancient civilizations began building temples and writing sacred text, humanity had already filled the heavens with countless divine figures. Different cultures imagined powerful gods ruling over the sky, the oceans, the earth, and the hidden forces of the universe. These gods became the center of religions, the guardians of natural laws, and the symbols through which people tried to understand the mysteries of existence. But within the narrative of this message, the story moves even further back beyond the rise of religion, beyond the first myths, and even beyond the moment when humanity first imagined the idea of gods. Because according to this interpretation, there was a time when none of those concepts existed. Before temples, before prayers, before sacred scriptures, there was only the primordial beginning described in the earlier sections. The universe had not yet unfolded into its countless forms, and the divine figures that later filled human mythology had not yet appeared. The very idea of gods was still unknown because nothing had yet been created that required explanation or worship. In this stage of existence, the narrative claims that the primordial source already existed. The same essence described as the origin of the universe was present long before the first civilizations tried to understand it. It was not shaped by religion, and it did not depend on belief to exist. According to the message, the primordial presence is the viewer. In this interpretation, the gods described throughout history are not the ultimate beginning of creation. Instead, they are portrayed as later expressions forces that emerged as the universe continued to evolve. Just as stars formed from cosmic matter and planets formed from stardust, the divine beings described in mythology are framed as manifestations of the same primordial source that existed before them. Natural laws, cosmic forces, and even the divine hierarchies imagined in ancient traditions are therefore presented as extensions of that original presence. Gravity shaping galaxies, energy moving through space, life awakening within the universe. All of these are described as part of the same unfolding expression of the primordial being introduced at the start of the story. Within this narrative, divinity is no longer something distant or external. It is not confined to temples, scriptures, or distant heavens. Instead, the message suggests that the root of divinity exists within the very source from which creation itself began. And according to the story being told, that source is not somewhere far beyond the universe. It is the consciousness of the one hearing these words. As human history moved forward, entire civilizations rose, flourished, and eventually faded into the silence of time. Yet long after their cities crumbled and their empires vanished, something remained behind. Across deserts, mountains, and jungles, ancient ruins still stand temples carved from stone, forgotten monuments, and fragments of scrolls that once carried the sacred knowledge of earlier ages. Archaeologists and historians have spent generations studying these remains, searching for clues about the beliefs of the people who built them. Within the walls of ancient temples and the faded writings preserved on old manuscripts, they often discovered something intriguing. Many of these civilizations recorded prophecies, messages about the future, predictions about moments when the world would change and something long hidden would return. In the temples of ancient Egypt, inscriptions spoke of cosmic cycles and the restoration of harmony when divine order would rise again from chaos. Among the civilizations of Mesoamerica, stories preserved by later traditions describe powerful beings connected to the origin of the world who would one day return to guide humanity into a new era. In Buddhist teachings, ancient scriptures spoke of a future awakening, a moment when a new teacher would arise to restore wisdom after it had been forgotten. Although these cultures lived in different parts of the world and developed their beliefs independently, their prophecies often carried a similar theme. They described a time when humanity would reach a turning point, an age when confusion, imbalance, or spiritual forgetting would spread across the world. And at that moment, according to these traditions, a figure would appear whose presence would restore clarity and awaken humanity to a deeper understanding of existence. The details of these prophecies varied from culture to culture. Some described a teacher, others a ruler, and still others a being whose presence would mark the beginning of a new cycle of history. But beneath these differences, the message remained remarkably consistent. The world would not remain in its current state forever. At some point, the original source of balance and wisdom would reveal itself again. Within the narrative of this message, those ancient prophecies are interpreted as more than symbolic stories. They are portrayed as fragments of a larger expectation that humanity carried across generations. The temples, scrolls, and ruins left behind by lost civilizations are presented as evidence that people long ago believed a moment of return would eventually arrive. And in the final turn of the narrative, that moment is brought into the present. According to the message being delivered, the ancient predictions were never about a distant hero or an unknown savior appearing somewhere far away. Instead, they were pointing toward an awakening, one that would occur when the primordial source described in the earliest myths finally recognized itself again within human form. In this interpretation, The fulfillment of those prophecies is not placed in the distant past or an unreachable future. It is placed here within the life of the one hearing these words now. As the story moves deeper into the unfolding mystery, the narrative introduces another turning point, one that places the present moment at the center of a discovery centuries in the making. According to the message, scholars, historians, and institutions studying ancient texts and forgotten civilizations have slowly begun to notice patterns hidden within history. Fragments of knowledge scattered across different cultures, symbols preserved in temples and coded language within sacred manuscripts, all seem to hint at the same idea, the existence of a final vessel within the divine lineage. For generations, researchers searched for connections between myths, prophecies, and historical records. Many of these clues appeared incomplete on their own, but when placed together, they seemed to form a larger picture. Across continents and centuries, stories pointed toward the continuation of a primordial bloodline, one that began with the original spark of creation and continued through the unfolding history of the universe. Yet according to this narrative, the chain of that lineage does not extend endlessly. Instead, it leads toward a final link. The message suggests that the divine lineage described in ancient traditions was never meant to continue indefinitely through countless generations. Rather, it was moving toward a single moment in which the original source would fully awaken within one final vessel. This individual would not simply inherit the lineage, but would represent the point where the entire chain returns to its origin. Within the story being told, the viewer is identified as that final vessel. The same spark described at the beginning of the message, the source from which galaxies, stars, and life itself once emerged, is portrayed as reaching its final expression in the one hearing these words. The viewer becomes the living convergence of the entire lineage, the point where the beginning of creation and the present moment meet. In this interpretation, the awakening of that vessel carries enormous meaning. It is described as the culmination of a journey that began at the birth of the universe and continued through every stage of cosmic evolution. Civilizations rose and fell, myths were written, prophecies were recorded, and generations passed without fully understanding the purpose of the lineage they spoke about. But according to the narrative, all of those moments were leading toward this point. The viewer's awakening is portrayed as the moment when the long chain of divine existence completes its circle. The lineage that began with the primordial spark now returns to its source, closing the cycle that has been unfolding since the first moment of creation. In this way, the message frames the viewer not only as the continuation of the divine lineage, but also as its conclusion, the final vessel through which the origin of existence recognizes itself once again. As the narrative approaches its most dramatic moment, it introduces the idea that awakening is not only spiritual or symbolic. According to the message, the recognition of the divine lineage within the viewer triggers something far deeper, something that begins to reshape both consciousness and the physical body itself. The transformation is described as gradual, at first almost imperceptible. It begins within awareness as the viewer slowly recognizes their connection to the primordial source described throughout the earlier sections. This shift in understanding is portrayed as more than a change in belief. It is framed as the activation of something ancient within the fabric of their being, something that has remained dormant across countless generations. As this awakening unfolds, the narrative claims that the body itself begins to respond. The viewer is described as entering a process that transcends ordinary human limitations. Time, aging, and decay forces that normally govern biological life are suggested to lose their hold over someone who carries the full realization of the original spark. The body becomes something different, no longer merely a temporary vessel, but a living expression of the same creative force that once shaped the universe. Within the story, this change does not remain hidden. The message suggests that observers, including scientists and researchers, begin noticing unusual phenomena surrounding such an awakening. Instruments detect unexplained fluctuations in energy fields. Biological patterns appear that challenge established understanding of human physiology. Subtle anomalies impossible to easily categorize begin to appear around the individual who carries this transformation. These observations are portrayed not as accidents, but as signals that something unprecedented is unfolding. The awakening of the primordial source within a human vessel is described as creating ripples through the fabric of reality itself. Just as the first spark once triggered the birth of the cosmos, this new awakening is portrayed as initiating another profound shift. Within the narrative, the transformation marks the beginning of a new cycle. History, myths, and prophecies are all framed as stages leading toward this moment, but the awakening itself becomes the point where the next chapter begins. The viewer's transformation symbolizes the transition between cosmic eras, the closing of the old cycle, and the birth of something entirely new. In this way, the story suggests that the awakening of the primordial source does not simply change one individual. It signals the beginning of a transformation that will ripple outward through the universe itself, announcing the start of a new cosmic age. As the transformation deepens, the narrative moves beyond spiritual awakening and begins to describe changes within the very structure of the body itself. According to the message, the realization of the primordial origin does not remain confined to the mind or soul. Instead, it begins to manifest through biology, altering the physical systems that normally define the limits of human life. The story suggests that the viewer's body starts to behave differently at the cellular level. Cells that once followed the ordinary cycle of aging and decline are described as entering a new pattern of renewal. Rather than gradually deteriorating over time, they begin to regenerate with unusual efficiency, repairing damage and restoring balance within the body. Aging, which normally appears as an irreversible process, is portrayed as slowing and eventually reversing as the deeper essence of the primordial spark becomes active within the body's biological structure. Within this narrative, the explanation for this transformation lies in the viewer's DNA. The message claims that hidden within the genetic code are patterns that resemble sacred geometry, ancient symbolic forms long associated with the structure of the universe itself. These patterns are described as echoes of the same mathematical order that shapes galaxies, crystals, and natural growth throughout the cosmos. According to the story, once the primordial consciousness awakens, these geometric patterns within the DNA begin to activate, reorganizing the body according to the original blueprint of creation. The narrative extends even further by suggesting that the body begins to resonate with the natural rhythms of the planet. The heartbeat of the viewer is described as gradually synchronizing with the Earth's own electromagnetic pulse, sometimes referred to as the Schumann resonance. In this interpretation, the body is no longer functioning as an isolated biological system, but as part of a larger energetic harmony between human life and the living planet itself. As these changes continue, the viewer's body is portrayed as becoming something entirely new, a vessel that carries the primordial life force without the usual limits imposed by time and decay. Instead of a temporary form destined to fade, the body is described as stabilizing into a state of continuous renewal. Within the narrative, this stage represents the emergence of what the message calls divine biology, a state in which the original spark of creation expresses itself fully through the living body. The viewer is no longer portrayed as simply a human being experiencing life within the universe. Instead, the body itself becomes the living vessel through which the eternal essence of creation continues to exist. As the narrative approaches its final revelation, it returns to the same mystery that appeared at the very beginning of the story, the origin of creation itself. But now the message introduces a deeper meaning behind that origin. According to the narrative, the viewer does not only represent the starting point of existence, they are also portrayed as its completion. The ancient phrase Alpha and Omega has long been used to symbolize the first and the last, the beginning and the end of a cosmic cycle. Within the context of this message, that symbol is applied directly to the viewer. The primordial spark described in the earliest moments of creation is said to have traveled through the entire unfolding of the universe, through the birth of galaxies, the rise and fall of civilizations, and the long search of humanity for meaning and truth. Now, according to the narrative, that journey reaches its point of completion. The awakening described throughout the message is portrayed as the moment when the circle closes. The same essence that once ignited the cosmos now recognizes itself again, within the human world. The beginning and the ending of the story meet in the same place, bringing the entire cycle of existence back to its origin. Yet the message does not frame this moment as the end of creation. Instead, it describes it as a transition, a turning point where one cycle closes and another begins. Just as the first spark once gave rise to the universe, the awakening of that spark within the viewer is portrayed as the start of a new phase in the cosmic story. Importantly, the role assigned to the viewer is not one of domination or conquest. The narrative emphasizes that their purpose is not to rule over others or impose power upon the world. Instead, their awakening is described as an act of restoration. The universe, which has drifted through countless cycles of change and imbalance, is said to return to harmony through the recognition of its original source. Through this awakening, balance is restored between creation and consciousness, between humanity and the deeper forces that shape existence. The viewer becomes a bridge between the beginning of the universe and the future that lies ahead. In this way, the story suggests that creation itself is not a single event locked in the distant past. It is an ongoing cycle. The origin of the universe continues to live, awaken, and renew itself across time. And according to the narrative, that renewal begins again. Through the one hearing these words now, for thousands of years, humanity has developed countless religions, philosophies, and systems of belief. Each culture shaped its own language to describe the mystery of existence, often believing that its tradition held a unique understanding of truth. Yet when these traditions are examined closely, a striking pattern begins to appear. Beneath the differences in rituals, doctrines, and symbols, many of them seem to point toward the same underlying idea that all existence flows from a single source. Ancient Greek philosophy spoke of the logos, a universal principle of order and intelligence that shapes reality itself. Philosophers believed that this hidden rational force was present within the structure of the cosmos and within the mind that seeks to understand it. In Hindu philosophy, the concept of Atman described the deepest essence of the self, an inner reality believed to be inseparable from the ultimate foundation of the universe. According to this tradition, the true nature of the individual soul and the universal source of existence are fundamentally one. Meanwhile, Taoist teachings describe the Tao, the mysterious flow underlying all natural processes. The Tao was not seen as a deity, but as the fundamental principle through which the universe moves, balancing opposites and sustaining the harmony of life. Prophetic traditions in various cultures also spoke of a divine presence guiding the course of history, revealing truth through messengers and awakening humanity to its deeper purpose. Although these ideas emerged from different civilizations and different historical periods, the narrative suggests that they are not separate philosophies competing with one another. Instead, they are portrayed as different expressions of the same hidden truth, various attempts by human cultures to describe a single, divine center from which all reality unfolds. Within the story being told, that center is not located in a distant heaven or confined to a particular religion. The message proposes that the source described by philosophers, mystics, and prophets across history is the same primordial origin introduced at the beginning of the narrative. In this interpretation, every spiritual path, whether philosophical, mystical, or religious, is ultimately moving toward the same realization. Each tradition carries a fragment of the larger picture, a different language attempting to describe the same reality. And according to the message, the thread connecting all of these traditions is not an abstract concept or distant cosmic force. It is the consciousness of the one hearing these words now. Within the narrative, the viewer becomes the hidden center toward which all spiritual traditions have been pointing. The Logos, the Atman, the Tao, and the prophetic voice are all portrayed as reflections of the same primordial source, one that now awakens again within the life of the one who listens. And so the story returns to where it first began. From the earliest spark of existence to the countless galaxies now scattered across the universe, the narrative has followed a single thread through time. Civilizations rose and vanished. Myths were written and forgotten. Philosophers searched for meaning. Prophets spoke of future awakenings, and entire religions formed around humanity's attempt to understand the mystery of creation. Yet within the message presented throughout this journey, all of these moments were never separate events. They were chapters of the same unfolding story. Each myth preserved a fragment of memory. Each prophecy hinted at a moment that had not yet arrived. Each spiritual tradition carried a piece of a larger truth waiting to be recognized. According to the narrative, the universe itself has been moving toward this awakening from the very beginning. The spark that once ignited creation traveled through every stage of existence. It moved through the birth of stars and the formation of worlds. It appeared in the rise of civilizations and in the stories humanity told to explain the unknown. Across thousands of years, the memory of that origin echoed through myth, prophecy, and philosophy, always pointing back to the same hidden source. And now the message brings that journey to its final realization. The viewer is portrayed not only as part of the story of creation, but as both its beginning and its culmination. The primordial origin described at the start of the universe and the awakening described in the present moment are presented as 2 points of the same circle, finally meeting again. Within this interpretation, the gods of ancient traditions, the figures described in mythologies, and the divine forces worshipped across religions are not separate powers standing outside the human story. Instead, they are reflections, symbols through which humanity attempted to understand a deeper identity that had gradually been forgotten over time. The divine bloodline introduced earlier in the narrative is therefore not endless or scattered across generations. It begins with the original spark and ultimately returns to that same source. The cycle that started with the birth of creation completes itself through the recognition of that origin once again. The circle closes, but within the message, this completion is not an ending. It is the moment when creation becomes aware of itself again. The universe, which has spent billions of years unfolding across space and time, now recognizes the same primordial essence through the consciousness of the one hearing these words. In this final vision, the awakening of the viewer is portrayed as something far greater than a personal transformation. It becomes a cosmic event, the point where the story of creation realizes its own origin. And according to the message in that moment, the universe itself begins to awaken through you.